November the 18th, 1943. A little after 9 in the evening, somewhere in the black air above the Dutch border, a German night fighter pilot is climbing through cloud with his hand on the throttle and his eyes fixed on nothing at all. His name does not matter yet. He is one of perhaps 200 men aloft that night in Messerschmitts and Junkers and Dornier, strung out along the invisible chain of radar zones that guards the western approaches to the Reich. He is not lost. He has never been lost in his life. Behind him on the ground sits a controller in a darkened room, full of plotting tables and glowing screens, a man whose whole job is to be the pilot's eyes. To take the raw returns from the radar sets and turn them into a calm voice in the pilot's headphones, telling him where to turn, when to climb, where the bombers are. That voice is the most reassuring sound in the pilot's world. It is German. It is confident. It knows things he cannot see. And then, on the same frequency, in the same language, with the same flat professional calm, a second voice arrives. It tells him the first voice is lying. It tells him the airfield he is heading for is buried in fog. It tells him to land. It tells him to orbit a beacon 200 kilometers from where the bombers actually are. And the pilot, turning in the darkness, cannot tell which voice is his own side and which voice belongs to the enemy. Both of them speak German like a man born to it. Both of them know the code words. Both of them sound like home. Pause on that for a moment, because this is the thing that will come to haunt the men who flew for the German night fighter arm in the last 2 years of the war. It is not the bombs, it is not the radar, it is the voices that came out of their own equipment, on their own channels, in their own tongue, and told them to do the wrong thing. And the strangest part, the part that some of them would carry for the rest of their lives, is that a good number of those voices belonged to men the German state had spent years trying to drive out or destroy. This is not a story about radios. This is a story about what happens when a country builds a machine so perfect that it forgets a machine can be spoken to. This is the story of the ghost voices over the Reich. To understand why a German controller could not explain the second voice in his pilot's ears, you have to understand what the Germans believed about the sky over their own country. And to understand that, you have to go back to the summer of 1940, when the night bombing of Germany was still a small and clumsy thing, and a colonel named Josef Kammhuber was handed a problem nobody in the world had yet solved. How do you stop an aircraft you cannot see at night, in the dark over your own cities? Kammhuber was a serious man, a career officer, methodical to the bone. Hermann Göring had ordered a dedicated night fighter force into being at the end of June 1940, and Kammhuber was the man told to build it. What he built became one of the most impressive defensive systems of the entire war. The British would name it after him. They called it the Kammhuber Line. Here is how it worked, and here is why the Germans trusted it the way a man trusts the floor beneath his feet. Kammhuber divided the sky into a belt of zones running roughly from Denmark down through the Low Countries and into the French frontier, a wall of boxes standing between the British bomber bases and the industrial heart of Germany. Each box was a self-contained hunting ground, about 32 kilometers long and 20 kilometers wide. Inside each one sat a set of radars and a single ground controller. There was a long-range early warning radar, called Freya, that could see aircraft coming from about 100 kilometers away, and there were 2 shorter-range precision radars, called Würzburg, dish-shaped sets that could lock onto and follow a single aircraft with real accuracy. One Würzburg would track a British bomber as it entered the box. The other Würzburg would track the German night fighter that had been sent up to wait there. Both tracks were fed down to a plotting table, where operators marked the 2 positions, the hunter and the hunted, closing on each other in the dark. And the controller, watching those 2 marks come together, would speak into his microphone and walk his pilot onto the target, turn by turn, until the pilot could see the bomber's exhaust flames ahead of him and open fire. Picture one of those interceptions as it actually happened, because the routine of it is the thing that bred the confidence. A single bomber crosses into the box. The early warning set catches it far out and passes a rough position. The night fighter, already airborne, is orbiting a radio beacon, waiting, burning slow circles in the dark. The controller has 2 blips now, one for the enemy and one for his own man, and a plotting table on which a beam of light throws the 2 positions up for everyone in the room to read. He begins to talk. He gives the pilot a heading. He gives him a height to climb to. He tells him the bomber is ahead and slightly above, closing from the left. The pilot cannot see anything yet. He's flying entirely on the voice. He trusts the voice. He turns when the voice says turn and climbs when the voice says climb. And then, if everything has gone right, his own small airborne radar picks up the target at close range, or he simply sees the 4 hot exhausts of a heavy bomber glowing against the lighter dark of the sky, and he slides up underneath it and fires. 1 controller, 1 fighter, 1 bomber, 1 box. It worked. Again and again, and every time it worked it deepened a certainty that would one day become a trap. The Germans had a name for this box system that tells you everything about how they felt inside it. They called it Himmelbett, which means a 4-poster bed, the kind with a canopy and curtains on every side, a closed space, a safe space, a place where everything is accounted for. And within its own logic, Himmelbett was close to perfect. The bombers in those early years came over in a loose straggle, spread out across the sky and across the hours of the night, and the box system dealt with them one at a time, methodically, like a man swatting flies that arrive politely one after another. The kill numbers climbed. The German controllers grew confident. The pilots grew confident. They came to believe the night belonged to them and that the voice on the ground was infallible. Their confidence was not foolish. This is the thing you have to hold on to. It was earned. It was built on real engineering and real results, and against the threat it was designed to face, it worked. The problem was not that the Germans were stupid. The problem was that they had built their entire system around a single unspoken assumption, and they had never once thought to question it. The assumption was this: that the calm German voice a pilot heard in his headphones could only ever be a friend, that the channel itself was safe, that because the words were in German and the code was correct and the voice knew the procedures, the voice must be one of theirs. Nobody in the Himmelbett system ever seriously planned for the day when the enemy would simply pick up a microphone and start talking. Their model imagined every threat that fitted inside the box. It did not imagine a stranger climbing into the box and speaking with their own voice. That blind spot might have stayed hidden forever if the box system had not first been broken open by something else entirely, because a defensive system that handles enemies one at a time has a terrible weakness, and the British eventually found it. If Himmelbett could only manage a handful of interceptions in each box each hour, then the answer was not to send the bombers in a polite straggle. The answer was to send them all at once, packed together, pouring through a single box in a dense river of aircraft the lone controller could not possibly sort out. The British called it the bomber stream. The idea had been pressed by the scientific intelligence men who studied the German defences, who worked out that if you concentrated the whole raid into one narrow corridor through one box, the arithmetic simply beat the system. A box that could handle 6 interceptions in an hour was worthless against 600 aircraft crossing it in 20 minutes. Hundreds of bombers funneled down that corridor in a matter of minutes, far more than any single controller could engage. The first great demonstration came against Cologne at the end of May 1942, when more than 1,000 bombers were sent over in a single raid. The box could not cope. It had been designed to deal with a trickle, and it was being asked to swallow a flood. Then, in the summer of 1943, came the blow that shattered the box system altogether. On the night of the 24th of July over Hamburg, British bombers began throwing out bundles of thin aluminum strips, cut to exactly the right length to throw back a false echo on German radar. The British code name for it was Window. It was almost absurdly simple. Just paper-backed metal foil, tumbling out of the bomb bays by the ton, drifting down through the night. But each strip returned an echo the size of an aircraft, and there were millions of them. The strips filled the radar screens with thousands of phantom aircraft, a snowstorm of false returns that buried the real bombers completely. The precision Würzburg sets, the very heart of the Himmelbett box, were blinded. The controllers on the ground watched their neat, readable picture of the sky dissolve into meaningless clutter. A woman who worked in the British listening service later described what the German operators sounded like that night, calling out again and again for a fix on a target their instruments could no longer find, drowning in false echoes, their careful system dissolving into chaos in front of them. The box was broken. The 4-poster bed had its curtains torn down. Now the Germans had to improvise, and improvisation meant something they had spent years avoiding. It meant loosening control. 2 officers offered a way out. One was a bold and unconventional man named Hajo Hermann, who argued that instead of tying fighters to individual boxes, you should let single-seat day fighters roam freely over the burning target cities, hunting the bombers by the light of the fires and the searchlights below. His tactic was called Wild Sow, the wild boar. The other officer, Victor von Lossberg, proposed the natural companion to it. Free the twin-engine night fighters from their boxes as well, and instead of tying each one to a single controller, feed them all into the bomber stream using one continuous broadcast. This was called Zami Sow, the tame boar. And here is the crucial point, the point on which this entire story turns. Both of these new tactics threw away the rigid certainty of the box, and both of them depended completely and utterly on one fragile thing: a running voice commentary. A single controller, or a small handful of them, broadcasting a live description of where the bomber stream was and where it seemed to be heading, out to every fighter in the sky at once. The Germans had solved one problem and created another without seeing it. In the old box system, spoofing the controller would have been nearly useless, because there were dozens of boxes and dozens of controllers, each talking only to his own single fighter on his own local link. To deceive the whole defence, you would have had to break into all of them at the same time, but now the entire night fighter force was hanging on a broadcast, a commentary, a few voices on a few frequencies telling everyone what to do at once. They had taken their greatest strength, central control, and stretched it into their greatest weakness. They had gathered all their eggs into one radio channel, and in a country house in Kent, and in a scattering of Lancaster bombers over the Reich itself, the British were about to reach into that channel and start pulling. Now cross the North Sea, because the men who were about to climb inside the German network did not come out of a great state laboratory or a vast armaments ministry. They came out of something much stranger, and much harder for the Germans to imagine. To find the first of them, you have to go to a country house in Kent, at a place called West Kingsdown, where a rambling manor had been taken over by the branch of British intelligence that did nothing all day and all night but listen to the enemy's radio. This was the listening service. Its people sat with headphones clamped to their ears, sweeping the German frequencies, writing down every code word, every call sign, every weather report, every irritable exchange between a controller and a pilot. Much of this work was done by women, sitting through the small hours with a pencil and a logbook, filling page after page with the enemy's chatter. They had been listening to the German night fighter network for a long time. They knew its rhythms, they knew its procedures. They knew, in many cases, the individual voices of individual German controllers, the way you come to know the voice of a stranger you overhear every single night. And listening, over months, a dangerous and beautiful idea had formed. If you know the network this well, why only listen? Why not speak? The British had been in the business of interfering with German radio since the very start of the war. Back in 1940, during what became known as the Battle of the Beams, a small unit had learned to bend and jam the radio beams the Luftwaffe used to guide its bombers onto British cities. That unit was numbered 80 Wing, and it carried a motto that could have served the whole enterprise: confusion to our enemies. The scientific brains behind this work sat at a research establishment where men like the physicist Robert Cockburn devised trick after trick, cheap, clever tricks meant to make expensive German equipment lie to the men who trusted it, and the intelligence world above them was presided over by a young scientist named Reginald Jones, whose gift was for thinking his way inside the enemy's mind, for asking not just what the Germans were doing, but what they believed, and where those beliefs could be turned against them. It was Jones more than anyone who understood that the way to beat a system was not always to smash it, but sometimes to whisper to it. By the autumn of 1943, the British decided to bring all of this scattered genius under one roof. They formed a new group within Bomber Command, numbered 100 Group, created in the middle of November 1943 under the command of Air Vice Marshal Edward Addison, the same officer who had run the beam jamming years before. Its job was not to drop bombs, its job was to protect the men who did, by blinding, deafening and deceiving the German defences. Its motto was as blunt as its purpose: confound and destroy. Within its ranks it would gather an arsenal of more than 30 different electronic devices, with a menagerie of strange code names, and it would fly special squadrons whose whole reason for existing was to haunt the German night. But of all the tricks that 100 Group and its sister units would play, the one that would burrow deepest into the memory of the German aircrew was the simplest of all. It was a human being speaking German, telling lies. The operation was given the code name Corona. It began on a terrible night, the night of the 22nd of October 1943, when Bomber Command struck the city of Kassel and set off a firestorm that killed thousands of people and burned for days. From the country house at West Kingsdown using powerful transmitters that could throw a signal off the upper atmosphere and deep into the middle of Germany, British operators went onto the German night fighter control frequencies and simply began to talk. They gave false instructions. They ordered fighters to land because of fog that did not exist. They sent aircraft to orbit beacons far from the real bomber stream. They passed out phony reports of the bomber's course and height. Sometimes, when there was nothing useful to say, they simply read out weather reports or recited nonsense, anything to clog the channel and drown the real controller in noise. They contradicted the genuine controller's word for word in fluent, confident native German, and on the ground, in his darkened room, the real German controller heard his own instructions being calmly overruled by a voice that sounded exactly like one of his colleagues, and he could not stop it, and he could not silence it, and at first he could not even understand where it was coming from. That first night produced the moment that has echoed down every account of this operation ever since. Though you should know, before I tell it, that the exact words have come down to us in several slightly different forms, translated and retold across the decades, so hold the precise phrasing gently. A German controller, hearing his orders sabotaged by the ghost on his frequency, lost his temper completely and began to swear. And the British voice, cool as anything, remarked to the listening pilots that the Englishman was now swearing. At which the furious German shouted back that it was not the Englishman swearing. It was him. The controller had been so rattled that he identified himself, in his rage, as the real one, which of course only deepened the confusion for every pilot listening, because now both voices were insisting the other was the imposter. That was the whole point. That was the entire, elegant, maddening point of the thing. To turn the German network into a hall of mirrors where no order could be trusted and no voice could be verified. Before we go on, I want to name what deserves to be named here, because a like on this video keeps these particular men from vanishing, and it costs you nothing but a moment. The voices that did this work were not for the most part ordinary British servicemen who had learned German at school. Many of them were native speakers, and many of those native speakers were refugees. They were German and Austrian Jews who had fled the Reich in the 1930s, some of them as children on the transports that carried Jewish youngsters out of Nazi territory to safety in Britain, leaving behind parents who many of them would never see again. These were people the German state had stripped of citizenship, driven from their homes, and in countless cases murdered the families of. And now they sat in front of a microphone and used the language of their childhood, the accent of their lost home cities, to reach into the German sky and pull the regime's own aircraft out of it. The persecutor had tried to erase them. Instead, he had handed them the one weapon he could not defend against. Their voices, their perfect, unmistakable native German voices. Let me give you some of their names, because they were real men and not symbols, and the record has kept enough of them for us to speak them aloud. There was a young man named Wolf Hermann Engelhardt, born in Leipzig in 1920, who escaped to England in the spring of 1939, just months before the war closed the door behind him. There was Gerhard Heilig, born in Vienna, whose father was a journalist the Nazis had imprisoned, and who came to Britain as a boy on one of the children's transports. There was a teenager who served under the English-sounding cover name Blake, so that if he were ever shot down and captured, the enemy would not know from his papers that he was a German Jew fighting against the country of his birth. And there was another, born in Vienna as Heinz Feldstein, who had celebrated his coming of age in a Vienna synagogue before the world he knew was destroyed, and who reached Britain by way of the same children's transport, and later took an English name. These were not distant figures. They were young men in their late teens and early 20s, and the language they spoke into those microphones was the language their mothers had sung to them. To carry this same trick into the sky, and not merely broadcast it from Kent, the British turned to a second operation with a second set of these operators, and this one was flown, night after night, in the belly of a heavy bomber over Germany itself. It was called Airborne Cigar, and it belonged to one particular squadron whose name deserves to be spoken with care, because it paid for this work more heavily than almost any other unit in the entire Royal Air Force. Number 101 Squadron, flying Lancaster bombers from an airfield at Ludford Magna in Lincolnshire, on a windswept ridge so wet and cold the men called it Mudford Magna. Here is what made 101 Squadron different from every other Lancaster squadron in Bomber Command. Its aircraft carried an extra man. A normal Lancaster flew with a crew of 7. the 101 aircraft flew with 8. That 8th man sat in a curtained-off position in the fuselage, surrounded by special radio equipment. A receiver that swept across the band of frequencies the German fighters used, painting the signals it found as little points of light on a small screen, and 3 powerful transmitters wired to aerials on the aircraft's back and belly. His job was to find the German control transmissions and destroy them. When he located a controller's voice, he would tune one of his transmitters onto it and unleash a warbling, howling note that swamped the frequency and drowned the words in noise. And when he had the German talking, this 8th man, who like the Corona operators was very often a German-speaking refugee, could also do something crueler and cleverer than mere jamming. He could answer. He could add his own false orders to the confusion, another ghost in the network, this one riding inside the very bomber stream the Germans were straining to find. It was one of these men who left us a small human detail that says everything about the strangeness of the work. On one of the first operations flying this equipment, the very first words the German-speaking operator heard coming up out of his headset, from a real German voice reacting to the intrusion, were a burst of furious cursing about the English arriving. Imagine sitting in the dark in the belly of a Lancaster over enemy territory, wearing a headset, and the first thing you hear from the other side is a man swearing at you in the language of your own childhood. That was the daily reality of the job. The extra equipment weighed more than 600 pounds, and installing it in a single aircraft took thousands of hours of work. Because the jammer only reached out about 50 miles, Bomber Command ordered that at least 8 of these special aircraft be scattered all through every major raid, spaced from the front of the stream to the back, so that wherever a German controller tried to talk, one of the ghosts was always close enough to shout him down. The Germans came to know the sound of it well. They gave the noise its own nickname. They called it the bagpipes. But that extra equipment came at a horrifying price, and this is where the courage of 101 Squadron has to be understood. The special transmitters, by their very nature, broadcast. They put out a strong signal on frequencies the Germans were monitoring, and a strong signal is a beacon. It is a thing that can be homed on, followed, and hunted. Every time the 8th man switched on his jammer to protect the bomber stream, he lit a small fire in the darkness that said, "Here I am, come and find me." The German night fighters learned this. They learned to home in on the emissions of the special aircraft, and so the men of 101 Squadron flew, on nearly every major operation Bomber Command mounted, in aircraft that were deliberately advertising their own position to the enemy for the good of everyone else in the sky. They flew more sorties than almost any other squadron in the force, and they died in greater numbers than any other squadron in the Royal Air Force. By the end of the war, more than 1,100 of their aircrew had been killed. The squadron lost around 146 aircraft. The men who spoke the ghost voices from inside the stream were among the most exposed human beings in the entire bombing campaign. Now widen the lens, because the real question underneath this story is not how the British did it. The methods, once you see them, are almost simple. The real question is why it was the British who did it, and why the Germans, with all their brilliance, could neither match it nor stop it. And the answer is not that the Germans lacked clever men. They had some of the finest engineers and scientists on Earth. The answer lies in 2 completely different ways of building a war machine, and in what each way could and could not imagine. The German system was a marvel of centralized order. It ran from the top down, through clear chains of command, through great state and industrial structures, with each man in his place and each place in its hierarchy. It was superb at producing refined, powerful, standardized equipment, and it was superb at running a system exactly as that system had been designed to run. But it had a weakness that was the exact shadow of its strength. It found it very hard to imagine an attack that came from outside the categories it had already defined. The Himmelbett box had planned for the bomber, for the jammer against radar, for every threat that fitted the engineering diagram. What it could not plan for was a human being who simply refused to accept the diagram at all, who looked at the whole network and asked a question no German engineering manual contained. Not how do I destroy this equipment, but how do I talk to it? How do I climb inside it and make it lie? The British, by contrast, had built their war effort around a peculiar national habit that ran back through generations, a deep and slightly eccentric respect for the gifted amateur, the outsider, the odd individual working at the edge of the official system who was allowed, sometimes just barely allowed, into the room. It was the culture that had produced the country parson cataloguing beetles in his spare time, the amateur astronomer, the tinkering inventor in his garden shed. In wartime, the British even had a word for the type. They called him a boffin, the slightly unworldly scientist or engineer attached loosely to the fighting services, tolerated, sometimes mocked, and occasionally decisive. Reginald Jones was a kind of boffin. So was the man who broke the German Air Force's navigation beams. This was a culture with just enough looseness in its joints to let an unexpected idea travel upward from a strange source and actually reach a decision-maker before it was crushed. And that same looseness is what allowed the British to do the thing the Germans could never have done in reverse. The British reached out and used the enemy's own people against him. They took the refugees the Reich had cast out, the German and Austrian Jews who spoke flawless German and understood the German mind from the inside, and they placed them at the very centre of the secret war. Consider what that meant, and consider whether the mirror image was even conceivable. The Nazi state, built on the idea of racial purity and the expulsion of the outsider, could never in 1,000 years have taken a British exile and made him the trusted voice of German air defence. The German system had defined whole categories of human being as enemies to be removed. The British system, for all its own prejudices and its own failings, was flexible enough and pragmatic enough to look at those same exiles and see not a category, but a resource, a gift, a weapon of extraordinary precision. The Germans had cast out the very people who could have warned them how it would feel to be spoken to in their own tongue by someone they had wronged. That was the structural difference. Not that one people was cleverer than the other, but that one system had left a door open for the outsider, and the other had bricked every door shut, and then wondered why it could not understand the voices coming through the walls. If your father or grandfather or uncle served in Bomber Command, in the ground crews that kept these aircraft flying, in the listening service, or in any of the strange secret units of the radio war, I would be glad to read their name and their unit in the comments below. These stories survive because families carry them, and because people like you pass them on. That is not a small thing, it is very close to the whole thing. Now let us go into the German cockpit, because it is one matter to describe the trick from the British side, and quite another to feel what it did to the men on the receiving end, turning in the dark, trying to work out which of the two calm voices in their ears was trying to kill them. Imagine you are that pilot. You have trained for months. You trust your controller the way you trust gravity. Tonight the sky is full of bombers, and you need that voice more than you have ever needed it. And tonight, of all nights, the voice has doubled. One of them tells you the stream is to the north, the other tells you it is to the south. One tells you your home field is clear, the other tells you it is closed by fog and you must divert. Both know your call sign, both use the correct phrases, both sound like men you have flown under, and the bombers are getting away while you hesitate, because hesitation is exactly what the second voice was built to create. Every second you spend trying to decide which order is real is a second in which no order is being obeyed. The trick did not need to fool you forever. It only needed to make you pause. It only needed to buy the men in the bombers a few more miles of darkness. The German response to this tells you everything about the trap they were caught in, because every single thing they tried, the British simply answered, and each answer was quicker and cheaper than the German move that had prompted it. First, the Germans reasoned that the British would surely never send women to fly over Germany, and so they concluded that any female voice on the network had to be genuinely German, and they put women controllers on the microphones to sort the real orders from the false ones. It was a clever piece of logic. It was also wrong, because it assumed the false voices were coming only from the aircraft overhead, and not from a transmitter back in England that could put anyone at all on the air. The British listened to this happen, and then they simply put German-speaking women of their own onto their transmitters. Now there were 2 female voices as well as 2 male ones, each insisting she was the true controller, and the confusion was worse than before. One British woman who did this work described a long exchange with her German counterpart that ended with the 2 of them, adversaries who would never meet, dissolving into laughter on air before shutting down, and she said afterward that she often wondered what became of the woman on the other side. So the Germans tried again. If speech could be counterfeited, they would stop relying on plain speech. They began transmitting their instructions as music, playing a continuous piece and breaking off only to snap out a quick order, on the theory that the British could not easily fake a whole broadcast of music. The British adapted. The Germans switched to sending their commentary in Morse code tapped out rather than spoken. thinking the code harder to spoof than a voice. The British adapted to that too. The Germans tried speaking faster, racing their orders out before the airborne jammer could find the frequency and lock onto it. It was not enough. In a moment of real desperation, they even took one of the captured airborne cigar sets, recovered from a 101 Squadron Lancaster that had been shot down over Berlin, and studied it, and understood exactly what it was and how it worked, and reported it all the way up their own chain of command. And still they could devise no effective answer to it. Knowing precisely how the ghost worked did not tell them how to exorcise it. For every lock the Germans fitted to the door, the British had already made a key, because the British were not attacking a piece of equipment. They were attacking the trust between a pilot and a voice, and there is no radio set in the world that can restore trust once it is gone. There was, in the end, only one true answer to the ghost voices, and it was not a clever trick at all. It was a machine designed from the ground up to be impossible to imitate, a system that sent the controller's information not as a human voice anyone could copy, but as a stream of data printed automatically onto a strip of paper in the cockpit, fed by a rotating radio beacon whose bearings a false operator could not fake. A machine cannot be talked into doubting itself. It simply prints what it receives. Had this system arrived in force, it might have closed the door on the ghost voices for good. But it came too late, in too few aircraft, and the war ended before it could make any real difference. The Germans had glimpsed the only cure, and they had run out of time to take it. For the crucial stretch of the bomber war from the autumn of 1943 onward, the ghost voices owned the German night. I want to be careful and honest now about what this actually achieved, because the truth is more interesting than the legend, and because a story like this can tempt you into believing a single clever idea won the war, and it did not. The ghost voices did not shoot down fleets of aircraft on their own. What they did was subtler, and in its way more important. They inserted doubt into a system that ran on certainty. They made every German order suspect. They forced pilots to hesitate, to fly to the wrong beacon, to land when they should have hunted, to burn their limited fuel chasing phantoms. They saved bombers not by destroying fighters but by wasting them, by sending them to the wrong corner of the sky, while the streams slipped past in the dark. Set against the enormous scale of the bombing campaign, it was one advantage among many, alongside the foil strips and the radar jammers and the roaming intruder fighters that hunted German aircraft over their own airfields. But it was a real advantage, bought with real ingenuity and paid for with real lives. And the lives must be named, because this is not a game and the cost was not abstract. On the night of the 30th of March 1944, Bomber Command flew to Nuremberg and suffered the worst single night of its entire war. Out of the great force that set out, 95 aircraft did not come back, and more than 500 young men were killed in a few hours. That night the whole apparatus of deception failed. The German controller for once read the situation correctly, ignored the diversions meant to fool him, gathered his fighters over 2 radio beacons that happened to sit right across the bomber's route, and fell on the stream in the clear moonlit air as it flew a long straight leg toward the target. The secret war of voices and signals was not magic. When it failed, men died in enormous numbers, and it did not always work, and the enemy was skilled and brave and adapting all the time. 101 Squadron alone lost 7 of its special aircraft on the Nuremberg raid. 7 crews of 8 men each, a great many of whom had climbed aboard knowing they carried equipment that made them a target. The heaviest price of all was paid quietly, in 1s and 2s, by the very men whose voices carried the ghost into the German sky. Return for a moment to Wolf Hermann Engelhard, the young man born in Leipzig who had escaped to England in 1939. He volunteered for this most secret and dangerous duty, and he was killed in the summer of 1944 on a raid to Stuttgart, and he lies today in a small cemetery in France, a long way from the city of his birth that had wanted him gone. Think of the teenager who flew under the cover name Blake, who was killed at the age of 19 on his very first operation, over Brunswick before he had even completed a single mission. Think of Gerhard Heilig from Vienna, whose father the regime had jailed, and who flew this work and survived it, and who refused throughout to change his obviously German name, because he would not let them take that from him too. These were the ghost voices, not phantoms at all, but frightened, determined young men in freezing aircraft and quiet rooms, turning the one thing the Reich could not confiscate, their mother tongue, back against the people who had tried to erase them. So why could the German controllers never explain the voices ordering their pilots to land? The Germans had radar, and the British had a country house full of people who simply listened. The Germans had a magnificent centralised system, and the British had 8 men scattered through a bomber stream, each one a lone ghost with a microphone. The Germans had built a machine that assumed the voice in the headphones could only ever be a friend, and the British had found the one kind of person who could be an enemy while sounding exactly like a friend. The exile who spoke the language better than the men who had banished him. The verdict here is not that the Germans were poor engineers. They were superb engineers, and the system they built was, against the threats it had imagined, close to flawless. The controllers who sat in those darkened rooms were skilled professionals doing an impossibly hard job, and on nights like Nuremberg they did it brilliantly and lethally. They were not fools. They were not cowards. They were beaten by a kind of attack their entire world had left no room to expect. The verdict is about imagination, and about what a system is willing to let itself imagine. A country that leaves a little space for the outsider, the amateur, the exile, the odd voice from an unexpected direction, will sometimes be handed a weapon a more perfectly ordered country cannot even conceive of, let alone defend against. The Germans lost this particular contest not because they were less intelligent, but because their vision of the world had no room in it for the idea that the people they had cast out might one day speak to them out of the darkness in their own beloved language and be believed. They had spent years insisting those people were not truly German, and then, on hundreds of nights, those same people proved themselves German enough to fool the entire night fighter force of the Reich. There is a bitter justice in that which no engineer could have designed, and the cost, once more, so that it is never mistaken for a triumph without a price. Bomber Command lost tens of thousands of young men over the course of the war, a loss rate so severe that a man who completed a full tour of operations had beaten the odds simply by surviving. The people beneath the bombs, in Kassel and Hamburg and Nuremberg and 100 other places, died in numbers that are hard to hold in the mind, and many of them had no more say in the war than the aircrew above them. The morality of the bombing campaign is an argument that has never ended and is not the purpose of this account. What can be said, plainly and without decoration, is that the men who flew the ghost voices into that sky, and the exiles who spoke them, did something brave and strange and clever, and that many of them did not live to see it understood. Let their names stand for the rest. Wolf Hermann Engelhardt of Leipzig, who lies in France, the 19-year-old who flew as Blake, lost over Brunswick on his first flight. Gerhard Heilig of Vienna, who kept his German name out of sheer defiance. The scientist who dreamed up the tricks, and the aircrew of 101 Squadron, who carried them over Germany at the price of more lives than any other squadron in the force. And behind all of them the quieter figures, the men and women in the country house in Kent who listened for years until they knew the enemy's network better than the enemy did, and then reached out and began, ever so calmly, to lie. I should tell you, in the interest of honesty, that some of the most famous exchanges from this campaign, the furious swearing controller, the duel between the 2 women that ended in laughter, have come down to us through memoirs and official accounts written after the fact, and the exact words vary from one telling to the next. The core of what happened is solidly documented and beyond serious doubt. The British did break into the German night fighter network. They did broadcast false orders in fluent German. Many of the voices did belong to Jewish refugees from the Reich. The Germans did try female controllers and music and Morse and could not solve the problem. All of that is real. It is only the precise dialogue, the exact phrasing of a shout in the dark more than 80 years ago, that we should hold loosely, the way you hold any words remembered long after the night they were spoken. If you want the next of these, and there are more inventors who were told no and pressed on anyway, more squadrons handed a task that should have been impossible, more men and women whose names deserve to outlast the people who tried to erase them and then follow along, because I am going to keep telling them for as long as there are stories like this one left to tell. The voices went out over the Reich on hundreds of nights between the autumn of 1943 and the last spring of the war. Some of the men who spoke them never came home. Some of the men who heard them are the grandfathers of people who may be watching right now. Their names are how the memory survives.